John, thanks so much for joining us. Everyone else, thanks so much for checking us out and watching us. I'm Jack, being joined by Anna, and everyone can see we have Jonathan Blow with us tonight, the creator of Braid and The Witness. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
All right. Well, I think we're just going to dive right into it with some fun questions. Okay. So I'm forever curious about the industry and the direction that it's headed in terms of perception by like the consumer and the end user. And one of the things I've been kind of thinking about is with indies, so many more indies. I think a lot of people are playing a lot more indies these days. Do you think that are we seeing like that perception of like the lines between like indie and AAA blur in terms of like the consumer and like where they place their confidence and like where they're spending their money? I feel like a lot more people are starting to turn to indies.
Well, yes and no, I think, right? So there's a lot of things to say here. Definitely indie games are a lot more prevalent. People take them seriously as real games now, right? Mm-hmm. It used to be if you played an indie game, if you even knew what that was, you were like, well, it's obviously going to be less good than whatever Electronic Arts thing came out that year, right? Mm-hmm. Now it's like, okay, it'll have a lower budget than that thing, but it might well be a much better game, right? And so that attitude has shifted. I do think people are pretty disappointed in AAA at this point. As a developer, I've been what you would call an independent developer since before that term existed, right? I've been in games since 1996. And, independent people were always complaining the whole time, ever since probably I heard these complaints in 1996 when I was new about how high budget games were very risk averse and boring, right? Like that's been a constant complaint forever. But that situation just keeps getting worse. Like we were complaining very loudly about this in like 2005, 20 years ago, right? But AAA games in 2005 were way more creative and risky than AAA games today.
Oh, yeah.
In part because the budgets are higher today, right? In part because I think also if you don't do something very much, you get worse at it and you forget how to do it, right? And so all these teams are trained on doing the sure, very marketable thing, right? And you just iterate on that and iterate on it and iterate on it, and the window keeps getting narrower and narrower of what people are willing to make. I think both of those are happening. And I think players are pretty disappointed at this point. I mean, I don't know for sure, right? Like, I'm not 18 right now. A lot of gamers are 18 or something. But I feel like most games that come out are not that exciting to most people. That's probably been true for a while. Also, there's way fewer AAA size games to get excited about to begin with. Just like I try to explain this. Like a year or two ago, I was like tweeting like, man, the industry is really slowing down. Like there's hardly any big games. And of course, you always get contrarian replies like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. Like in March, this game's going to come out. And in June, this game's going to come out. And you could name like one big game per quarter that anybody cared about. And it was like, no, dude, that used to be like every couple of weeks, there would be several big games that people were excited about. And so that has definitely changed. Now on the indie side, there's way more games, but I think because there are so many games and because it's so hard for those games to connect with their audience, I think a lot of people just look at this giant sea of games and they're like, I don't really know what I should be looking forward to or what I should play, right? And so I think the indie sector would be more successful if that problem got solved somehow, right? And the thing is, there are places that have a little bit of this kind of solution. So like Steam, if you like click through 7 different links, there's like the interactive recommender or whatever that almost nobody uses because it's kind of hidden.
I never do.
And like, that doesn't totally solve the problem, but it probably helps a little bit. But that's not, it's not the default interface.
Yeah.
And Steam honestly is not, I don't think they're very heavily incentivized to solve this problem because, you would only do that if you believed people would buy a lot more games, right? And they probably look at their numbers and they still see that like the biggest budget games still probably make the most money. And then occasionally there's an indie breakout hit that makes a bunch of money. We must also remember, though, that Minecraft made $2 billion while an indie game. So there's an occasional extreme outlier that changes all of these. But you can't assume the outlier is the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was always hoping that Steam. So when Steam initially came out with their Greenlight program, I thought that was kind of great because the community could sit and look at all these games ahead of time and then vote on them. And then that was sort of this level of curation that we have. But now anybody could release a game on Steam whenever they want. And just last year alone, I think the number was, last I looked at it, was over 18,000 games released on Steam in a single year.
That's a little bit of a deceptive number because I think
does that count
a large
like DLCs
percentage of
and
those are
stuff?
total trash that nobody would ever play. Right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So like if you filter it by, I saw this stat, I don't remember what the number it was, but if you filter it by how many games make $5,000, like a small enough number that you wouldn't be able to live on that, right? That number drops to like, again, I don't remember but it's like one digit less. It's like 3,000 or 5,000 games.
Yeah.
Right. But that's still a really lot of games, right? That's 10 games a day, every day for a whole year, if they were evenly distributed, which they're not.
Because, going through Steam, like you were saying, even with their automated recommendation system, I still never see like, I mean, I mostly don't see when I'm assuming I don't see shovelware. I'm assuming those are going to be showcasing games that actually sell.
Probably.
But, that's another thing too, is just like the overall saturation. You go to other places like Itch. That has become like strictly like the place you go for horror games, I guess now apparently.
Okay,
But they do have a lot of really, really good stuff. There's a couple gems in there too. I saw you tweeted one, and I was playing it the other day too. Dragonsweeper.
Yeah, that's a good game.
Yeah, that was deceptively good too. It's very innocuous when you look at and then you start playing 10 minutes later. You're making yourself coffee and button it, getting down for
good
it. But
design can go a long way, even with a very like that game. Obviously, has a budget close to zero, right? But it's fun.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of developers forgot that part.
Yeah. So do we think that, especially with what you were saying, with not as many AAA games have been releasing, and that's certainly a thing. I remember when I was younger, you always flipped into the magazines, just so much stuff. Oh man. So I'm in my upper 40s, so I think we're similar in age. You might be just a tad older than me, I believe. But yeah, do we think that AAAs are starting to lose a little bit of ground to indies now? Because definitely there have been, I've noticed a lot more, especially people on social media, a lot more influencers playing more indies than AAA, than they used to at least. So do you think that perception shift has happened in terms of the consumer?
How I feel about it is, there is this weird thing going on. Like, so obviously the AAA games have much bigger marketing budgets, right? Much bigger development budgets. And they're using that muscle to try and get people's attention, right? But lately, especially, there's almost 100% inflection to the downside. Like they'll hype something up as being really great. And then everybody kind of knows they're going to be disappointed. And then it comes out and they're either mildly disappointed or extremely disappointed in the case of, depending on which game you pick, right? Whereas with indie games, it's usually like surprise inflection to the upside, right? So like you had a game, let's pick a game with a relatively low budget, like Animal Well was very successful, right? Within the past year. It came out last year, but we're early this year. And that had sort of the independent influencer equivalent of heavy marketing behind it, right? Like donkey videos get a lot of hits and all that. But I still think that game wouldn't have gone that far if it wasn't like really interesting in a way that most games weren't, right? And so I do think that it's probably important to have that, I would say, then on games of both scales. It's just we're used to different things, right? Like nobody will talk about an indie game if it doesn't have that surprise to the upside. Whereas a AAA game will get some kind of discussion and like everybody complaining about it just because they have the money to pay for the saturation. But even though like the amount of time that people discuss some of these games with big budgets is like really short now if they don't hit.
Yeah, this one, and they kind of tend to close off really early if they don't hit right out of the gate. Apparently, like Concord was one of them, but that I think is just
or the one that I was really because Concord, generated a lot of controversy, right? And so that probably didn't lead people to buy the game, obviously, but there was a lot of discussion there. But there were games with less controversy, but that I didn't hear a peep about after, like the Star Wars game that came out, like. Man, that prior to it coming out, people were like, snarkily saying, I bet this is going to be terrible or whatever. And then it came out and crickets. Like nobody cared about that game at all.
I saw a lot of memes being posted of like all the weird bugs, like especially with the AI, how the AI was just kind of awful in that game and like would just like not notice a player 2 feet in front of him.
Yeah, I saw one of those. Yeah.
But that's another thing too about the swing and perception.
Because I have a second thought about that, right?
Okay.
That's not even just a AAA game with a big budget and a lot of people working on it for a long time, right? That's also the Star Wars franchise, right? Which has like huge name share going back to when I was 6 years old or something, right? Like one of the most incredibly big, most easily marketable things in the universe, right? And it just fell flat. And of course, there have been other steps in degrading Star Wars. Yeah. So it's not like that game takes all the blame, but still, man, like if you can't do something with that, you got problems.
Probably one of the most high-profile IPs in existence.
Yeah.
Star Wars. And it's just
Concord, you can understand. It's like, okay, they launched a new thing. It wasn't something that anybody wanted. Well, here's another thing. Like one thing that people will say now, and I think this is true to some extent, and it doesn't even matter in what direction it's true, right? But I think a lot of these AAA studios are making games. Again, they're trying to be risk averse, right? So they've got some template of what they think the game should be. And it's not informed very much by feedback from the outside, or that's very slow. And so, they end up like, if you're trying to shoot a moving target and your bullets are really slow because they take 4 or 6 or 8 years to shoot, it's going to be really hard to hit that target, right? And so I think that's been happening. But so with Concord, it's like they made a new IP and there's all sorts of reasons probably why it didn't hit, but you can at least understand why making a new IP wouldn't succeed. Like that's been true for a long time. But like we actually know what people like about Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
And we know what people didn't like, and even the movies and the series that didn't go well, we know what people liked and didn't like about those. There's like if you're going to make a Star Wars game, it's very clear what that should be, right? Especially because going back to the early history of Star Wars games even, right? Like Jedi Knight and whatever, not the remake, the original one. Mm-hmm. Like that was a very successful game that people loved. And it was sort of winging it. Like it used material from the books and stuff or whatever, but it was just like, they were just like, what do people like about Star Wars? Wouldn't it be cool to make a game? Like things were so much more innocent back then. It was like, wouldn't it be cool if we had like Star Wars in a game? Like, yeah, you had that in the arcade cabinets or whatever, but what if you were like running around as like a Jedi? Isn't that what people love about Star Wars? And that was the motivation back then. And like somehow that's been completely lost.
I think, back then developers used to be fans. They used to like the material that they were working with. And I think that totally changed over the years now, because I get this, maybe it's just me. I get this feeling that the AAA industry wants to be Hollywood so bad and act like Hollywood and just feel like, I don't know. I don't even know where that comes from. But when I was growing up, like take a look at old Blizzard, the games that they made, you know what I mean? I need these old companies. And it's just like, they were fans of what they were making when they were making it. I don't get that feeling now. When I play something new from a AAA developer, I don't get the feeling that they're fans of what they're doing. I get the feeling that they're just putting everything on a conveyor belt and it's being focus tested by soccer dad who is impressed that his phone has the I could drink beer app, from circa 2006, like somebody's impressed by that and shiny things.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like they're as fans as much. That's where I see like a lot of indies pulling up and coming in, especially with a lot of tight experiences. Like Celeste, great example of an awesome platformer. Just the experience there was really, really tight. We don't see that, I don't think, from AAA, at least not in the larger sense from most studios, most big studios. And I think that has slowly, because I think a lot of other consumers are picking up that these developers aren't exactly fans anymore like they used to be. And I think that has definitely caused a divide. Like consumers could vibe on that. I could vibe on that. I play games all the time. I consider myself as a good consumer just the same. And I could vibe that too. I could feel when a developer, their heart's not into it. The game, it's just like lacks a soul. It's hard to describe, but for sure,
Well, I think, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of that is the industry is so much bigger now. And when it was smaller, you basically had, like, the population didn't grow that fast. Like, the population of Earth didn't grow that fast, but the industry has scaled up a huge amount, right? Relatively speaking. And so you used to just have the people most excited about the ideas of making video games, and salaries were a lot smaller, so you wouldn't really get into it for the money. In fact, you had to love it because the money was pretty poor a lot of the time, most of the time. And it's just easier to have like friendships in the industry and motivate each other when it's smaller and more people. And then, in terms of a particular game, like if you're on a game and it takes 1 year to make or 18 months to make, you can develop this enthusiasm and it can last that long, right? You can fire yourself up. A lot of people even have trouble being motivated for that long, but in 18 months, you could get it at the beginning, you could lose it in the middle, and then you can get hyped that the game is coming toward the end and like really put in the effort. When a game takes 5 years, 6 years, I've been working on something for 9 years, God forbid.
Yeah, I've paid attention to some
much
of your streams,
harder. Yeah, it is much harder to maintain that enthusiasm. And and then with team size, again, if you're making a game with 10 other people, you have a really big individual contribution to that game, which means multiple things. It means your decisions have a bigger determination on what the game becomes. And it also just means that your role is much more important, right? If you let the team down, the game's not going to get done as fast, or it'll be missing some stuff, and players won't like it as much and stuff, right? So there's at least a couple dimensions there of why your role is so important. When there's 1,000 people working on a game and you're like the guy who makes dinner plates for GTA 6 or whatever, it's like, what are you gonna, I mean, I guess you have a little bit of like, oh, I'm working on this big franchise name and I could feel, I can name drop that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's not the same. It's not passion, right? Nobody's going to be passionate about being the guy who makes dinner plates and then maybe cups if that other guy quits or whatever, or is slow.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it too, and for certain true, because that's something else when it comes to like AAA studios and big corpos, and I don't know how their brains work, like what their thinking is. Like if let's say they start out with like a 200 person studio, that's quite a lot of people. If they double that, you're not going to get another 200 people worth of output out of that.
You never are.
It's diminishing, and I don't know. It's just something that always confused me because like I'm a nobody. I'm a small guy. I'm additional programming by. I hop around from game to game to game to game to game in indies. So it's like, I don't know that part of the business end, but I see them as making a whole lot of mistakes. And I'm curious if in the future, especially with the way 2024 has been, like, do we expect the AAA industry to course correct in any way? And like, how long do we think that would take, even if they're going to do it? That's something that I've been thinking about.
I think it's likely, but it's hard, so it may take a long time. And then we didn't talk about, actually, I meant to mention this in the earlier discussion, but it also applies to this. So I'll circle back to that for a second, right? Most AAA games have been pretty disappointing, and I think a lot of them have not done well in the past couple of years, last year especially. But some are more successful than ever. So like Fortnite's doing great, for example, right? In part, I think because it's a game that established itself and people know they can go back there and get, basically the game that they enjoy with some minor changes every once in a while when there's an update. And it's sort of become people's hobby or whatever, right? And that maybe kind of sucks the air out of the room out of a lot of these other games as well, right? But so circling back to this question of like, is the AAA industry going to have to correct? That's sort of how economics works, right? Is just if people won't pay for your thing, you're not going to be able to do it. And you might get one or two cracks at it, but pretty soon, if you don't get the money back to do more of the thing, you won't be able to do the thing, right? And
right.
So, so what does that mean? If you're making one of these games that didn't do well, one of the things you would try to do is try to make something that more people are likely to enjoy, right? Mm-hmm. And there are several dimensions to that. There's like, what is the design? What is the visual style? What is the story, right? Maybe pick things that people are going to like more. But there's also things that are harder, like what is the actual quality of the game? Like you could have a good idea for the art and the story and the characters, but like then the implementation kind of sucks and the game's unplayable and janky, and it'll probably do poorly, right? In that case. So that's something that needs to get fixed. And then on this question of how many people does it take to make a game? Well, there's a lot of reasons why people think that number is high. One of them is it's a fact about paying people to do things that you always can see what you would do with more help, right? Because these projects take a long time, they're hard. Sometimes things don't go well. You're like, man, if we had an extra 2 programmers, then you get them and you're like, man, if we had an extra 2 programmers, right?
Yep.
And it just keeps going like that, right? But then there's also a lot of what you would call perverse incentives that happen at all large companies, right? So let's say, in theory, people are stymied by this sometimes because it appears to be a paradox at a high level, right? So like the point of capitalism is supposed to be that you want to make a profit, and that means you want to make a thing people like that's hopefully high quality, some combination of high quality or cheap, right? If it's super cheap, it doesn't have to be as good, right? But like you want to make the thing as cheaply as you can because that's better for you, right? As a company, you take more profit home, right? But when you look internally to a company, let's say someone's a middle manager within this company. What does that person want? Do they want the game to be good? Or whatever, the website to be good, or, because we're talking more generally. Sure, maybe, but really they also want their career to advance, and they probably have ego issues, and they want to feel more important, and they want to make more money. And how do you do that? Well, if you lead more people, then you're more important, right? And so managers always have an incentive to grow their groups, and then especially, there's this really bad budgeting practice that a lot of companies have where it's like, if you don't spend, we gave you a budget for 2024, and if you didn't spend it all, then that obviously is how much you need. So we're going to give you this decreased budget for 2025, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody knows that. And so they spend their whole budget, which not only is bad because in that moment you spend more money than you needed to spend, but it leads to a disrespect for expenditure, right? Like at some level, money is the blood of the company, right? And so you should be very careful about it. And it leads to an internal culture where that's not the case at all, right? And so there's lots of other weird stuff that happens inside companies too. Now that a lot of people work, like if I ran a big company, the number one thing I would do is declare a return to work in the office policy. And I can't actually do that because my company's too small. I would like to figure out how to do it longer term though, because it's the only way that people will really work at the efficiency that they worked in the past. Because, a small percentage of people are better just at home on their own recognizance, right? But most people are less efficient, honestly.
I would think adding to that,
substantially less.
Yeah, creativity also, being around other people, being able to quickly toss ideas back and forth without doing it through email or Zoom meetings. It's so much nicer.
Going back to the passion and inspiration that you were talking about, like we're human beings, and if you're like next to somebody and you could like feel the energy of what they're doing, that communicates better. It passes between people better. If you can look around and it's like, wow, everybody's doing something cool today, that really works. It's a lot harder just because we're embodied human beings. It's a lot harder if you're just looking at Slack or even a video call or something. Our brains don't work that way. You don't get that inspiration, Yeah. And then like when you've got all these remote workers, you have to have extra structure to police the remote workers to make sure that you kick people out if they're not working. And that's really unpleasant and takes resources. And most companies are trying to be nice because, there was this idea going way back that games industry had too much of a crunch culture. And there was a lot of really bad press about that from, I don't know, even really going back to probably 2010, but around 2014 to 2017, when the press got really anti-games industry, but the games industry hadn't started rejecting the press yet. Because at some point, like, it's fine to be critical of the industry and all that, but you got to be fair, right?
Yeah.
And at some point with the journalists who were sort of in office at that time, it wasn't really about being fair. It was just about finding what you can criticize today because that generated clicks, right? And so I think most people in the industry now realize that old model of gaming press is still deeply unfair. And, different parties have reacted to that in different ways.
Very much so. But it's much more incestuous between, I think, especially a lot of the big corpos and a lot of the big media outlets. There's definitely a lot of nepotism going on back and forth.
Yeah, for sure. But going back to then, there was still this idea, though, that like, if they're criticizing our work policy, if we have a better work policy, they'll stop criticizing us or whatever. And that's not how it works at all. They just find a different thing, right? And it is true that there was a little bit too much crunch culture in notorious places, but and poor management leading to people working too much and all that. But the games industry is a really big industry, and honestly, the vast majority of it was fine, And also, I think there should be a place like, look, so SpaceX is like this, right? You only go work at SpaceX if you know that you want to work like 12-hour days or more, right? With extreme crunch sometimes, because like they're on a mission to like get to Mars and there's a deadline, right? And all this stuff. For the minority of people who want to do that, I'm all in favor of that actually, because, it's like going to boot camp and then, going to SEAL training or something, right? Like SEAL training isn't about working 4 hours a day and taking a lot of naps, right? It's really hard. And most people don't make it, but like you go there because you want to be the really good version of that, right? And I wish we consciously cultivated that in the games industry more. And to be honest, I might have a vague plan about something like that later on. We'll see. But that shouldn't be right. Most of the industry shouldn't be like that. And you should know it going in. It shouldn't be a thing where it's like, I thought this was a normal job, and then I was pressured coercively into working extra, or I would be fired, or whatever. And that probably did happen a little bit in the industry, but it was not super widespread. But so the industry overreacted, and now everybody has been trying to be super progressive and all that, and that leads to not calling people on it when they're not really doing work, right? And so that massively bloats the budget of these games, which if you're a gamer, think about it this way, right? If a game used to cost $60, right? But now, to make an equivalent game this year, the team is only half as efficient at making the game. They only put in half as many hours on average, which is probably realistic. Either the game's going to be half as good or half as much work, or it's going to cost $100, right? Before you even get to inflation or anything, right? This is just like, how many people does it take to make the game? And I think that's another thing that hit the industry really hard, is these bigger companies have been very slow to notice that a lot of people just actually aren't really doing very much work. And also, there were lots of reasons why you could see that they were letting this happen for a while. Like, you go into COVID and everyone has all these dramatic things to know. I mean, the summer of 2020, or, the first 6 months of 2020 was crazy, right? And there were all these distractions and people were having a hard time a lot of the time. And you want to be good to people, and, you don't want to like crack a whip over somebody when they're having a really bad time. And so there's legit reasons for that, but like, it's sort of, sort of the way 2 weeks to flatten the curve turned into a lot longer than that. If it's like, okay, people are going to be unproductive this week because something really dramatic is happening. If like 6 months later, you're still doing that, something's starting to be really wrong.
To some people,
especially
we're
at
about
the budget levels
years,
of these companies. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, to some people, we're about to hit 5 years into 2 weeks to flatten the curve soon. So
yes.
They're still living it to this day.
But, but the company version of that is happening, right? There's like, and okay, here's another thing, right? Because it's a growing industry still, it may have stopped growing in 2024, but up until then, it was a growing industry, rapidly growing, right? And so anytime you have a rapidly growing industry, a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, don't have very much experience, right? That's like what because you're adding so many people every year, a lot of people are green. So let's say you're just a programmer on the team, and you're trying to learn how much you should get done. You maybe learn that from other people on the team if you just left school and it's your first year. Well, what do you learn in 2023 versus 2013, right? In 2013, people around you are probably doing a lot of work. So you learn that. In 2023, it's like, well, we got a couple of meetings and, we're just sort of doing this and that. And I got one bug fixed on today. And so you learn that and you calibrate on that, right? And then people managing the company, how do they know what's a reasonable amount of productivity? Again, picking programmers specifically. And it's not clear, because even if you've been in the industry a long time, like, the graphics techniques get more complicated, the engines are more complicated with a lot more code, they take longer to compile, so the workflow has more friction, right? The consoles have more features to support, and all these things. Maybe there's more platforms. Maybe that's leveled out, but like, we just shipped a game on 9 frickin' platforms for a tiny indie company. That's crazy. It's a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
And so it actually is hard, even if you've been in the industry a long time, to like, if you want to be a good manager and make sure the team's productive without, being mean or unfair, you have to know what the target level of productivity even is. And that's actually very hard to know. If you're not like somebody on one of these productivity teams who's very diligent and knows you're working your 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to a good level of capability, right? Like, if you observe that person, if you even have a person like that who's observable, which most teams don't anymore because people just don't work that way, even if you did, that person is a really rare gem now. Like, it almost feels, especially on these bigger teams, it almost feels unreasonable to expect anyone but your very best people to do that. Whereas that used to be like a regular workday, right? And so this is a very deep problem. I don't know how you solve it without, maybe you take one of these policies where you're like, look, we're returning to office. You've got to be here a certain amount of time, a certain number of days a week. And if you don't like that, we're going to give you a generous package to leave. Like, that seems to be the playbook for these scenarios. And that's what I would do if I were running one of these companies.
When it comes to like return to work and stuff, and we were talking about going back to a little bit to just like the size and scope of video games these days, especially like the size of companies. And all this stuff, especially you're talking about return to work. My brain is just kind of jumping ahead a little bit here. I apologize. It gets twisted.
I think about this issue a lot simply because I'm unable to do it. And even though we're a small company, we've had some problems with this and we fix them when they come up. But we were in an office before in San Francisco before COVID, and we were about the same size company as we are now. And things just worked a lot better in person. Like, just observing the difference is astonishing.
I believe it. Yeah. Being around other people that are creative, especially other people that are creative, is a huge boost. Even if you're a programmer too, because that requires a certain degree of creativity. Everyone thinks programming is just code, but no, you've got to be able to solve problems, and sometimes solving problems require solutions that aren't exactly boilerplate. But thinking about like development and team sizes, do games actually need to be as big and that's kind of a weird question to ask, though, I think, because I think a game could be anything it needs to be. But I think in terms of what the consumer expects, especially in regards to like technology, we starting to see people move towards Unreal Engine versus their own in-house engines.
Yeah.
Are games becoming too complex? Like, do you think the consumer even cares about it? Because I look at something like Vampire Survivors just came out of nowhere, and it's just like you don't even press any buttons, you just move, and it was smash hit. And I saw a tweet once. I think what was this for? Somebody made a tweet where, gamers expect too much these days, and the reply was just a screenshot of Vampire Survivors. Like, this is the expectation.
I mean,
I'm trying to think of if spending this much money, like, do we need to spend this much money on like pretty graphic, like that we like all the big people?
I don't
Sony,
think
Microsoft,
we need to. But here's the thing: is that used to be the predominant strategy to almost ensure a hit, right? Mm-hmm. Was just to spend the most money and have the best graphics and whatever. And that playbook worked for a really long time. It's not really working anymore. But again, like I was saying, the studio's idea of being risk averse is to still run these playbooks that used to be good, right? And the problem is, let's say even you're there and you realize this isn't the right play anymore. You still need to come up with a play that will work and like suddenly be creative and have much more joy in your heart than you currently do is a very difficult demand, right?
Yeah.
But then also there's a business angle, which is the following. So a big company like Ubisoft or Electronic Arts or whatever is not just trying to make games, right? They're trying to make games at a certain budget level. Why are they trying to do things at a certain budget level? Because over time, they've evolved into machines that deploy a certain amount of capital to get a certain amount of profit, right? So like, if you have $100 and it's probably hard to invest $100, right? But let's pick a bigger number like $10,000, right? You could probably find some ways to invest that in a business and make 10% with a reasonable degree of success and beat the market and all that stuff, right? When you have $2 billion, your options for investing that money are way less, right? Because there's not, especially if you want surefire, secure things, there's not as many things, right? You're maybe going to one of these very large venture capital funds or something, or maybe you're going to a company like Electronic Arts and saying, hey, here's a fraction of my $2 billion. Please use this to make your, next, do their sports games still make money? I don't know. One of those, right? Relatively, you can set the clock to whatever year it would be when like FIFA was a guaranteed profit maker or something. If it isn't, I don't follow these. So you would do that, and that would be one of the ways that you knew how to employ that degree of capital. But the entire company is geared around that, right? So if you know how to make games for $600 million, let's say, and you return some fraction of that in profit, and that's at least kind of reliable, you're not going to want to do anything for like $5 million. That's 1% of like the budget that you are geared up to deploy, right? But $5 million is a huge amount for an indie developer for most of them, right? And so what, they're just very separate universes at that point, all of a sudden.
Do we think that, and this is a question I've been thinking about for a little bit now, like if the consumer can do anything to kind of help push, to kind of help get the larger, like the top portion, like all the AAA and stuff like that, kind of back on track, because I do think that they drove straight off the road a little bit rather than trying to hang on.
To bring that last point all the way home, to connect it to your previous question and also this one, I think. So my point behind making that 600 million versus 5 million thing is just that if you're geared up for $600 million, but the solution to your problems is this is not a viable budget level for games anymore, right? You need to be $60 million instead of 600 or something, which may be true. That might be the fact that we are faced with right now. That looks like dismal failure to your company, because all of a sudden you either have to make 10 times as many games as you're currently set up to make, which is basically impossible. Because like for the same reason you said you can't add more people and get the same amount of efficiency, if a team is making something at a certain scale, those people are geared toward contributions at that scale. If you break that into 10 teams, you're asking for bigger contributions from everybody, but that's not what they're hired for, and that's not what you train them for, and that's not what they're ready to do, right? And so that doesn't really work. And so you would be looking at like, well, our company just has cash flow that's, 3 times or 5 times or 10 times less than it used to be, which is like horrible. Any business owner looking at that would be like, oh my God, we're cratering straight into the ground. So I would expect them to resist that as much as possible.
Yeah.
And try other things, is my point. Is like, even if that's really the truth, is your budgets have to get really much lower, they will resist that very hard, I think.
I think their expectation, especially with what we've seen, like Sony, I guess, had canceled internally several games that they had lined up as games as a service, forever games. I think a huge problem, like we're talking about money, is the perception that whatever you do, that you can have all the money, even though there's only a finite amount, like on the planet. But I think a lot of these companies go in thinking that there's always going to be more pie, and that's not necessarily the case. It's just that pie still has to get split among everybody, and you're constantly fighting with other developers, to try to put out your product against theirs, this, that, and the other. You're always trying to grab this, and I don't think that's feasible anymore. I don't think that, and I know what you're saying when it comes to, and I don't know what the solution is either. When it comes to trimming down budgets, you're not going to be making as much. You'd have to pump out more games, this, that, and the other. And I think, is hubris the right word? Just this, the way they think of themselves and carry themselves, and especially with the way they present games that they make to the consumer, I think tells a lot about the kind of people that they are. And I don't think it's necessarily, obviously, the developers that are making it, but it's all the people that are making the decisions on a game. And there's been plenty of games that come out, especially last year, where I'm like, this wouldn't be such a controversial topic, and this wouldn't be such a controversial thing that you're putting in your video game had you just presented it to the player in a better way. But because of the way you presented it to the player, I understand you don't like the player. Yeah. And you probably loathe them by putting this conversation in a game and doing the things that you're doing. And I see that. And I don't think that AAA companies are going to be willing to accept that they do need to make changes moving forward if they want to continue to be successful, and they also have to adjust expectations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a fundamental attitude shift that needs to happen. And so for a long time, this is one of the ways that I've thought about what I do and what a lot of other indies do as opposed to AAA. Because we know these companies, they've just been trying to make money for a long time, right? That's been their primary purpose. But they had enough like legacy game designs to operate on, and still enough people on their staff who really liked games, that the games would still come out okay a lot of the time, right? Even if the purpose of the company was just to be a machine that makes money. But especially once the microtransactions era started, that started getting even more corrupted. And there's sort of this question about what is your relationship to the player? Like, which way does the flow of energy go, or the whatever, right? So when I am making a game, it's very clear to me that I'm trying to make something good for the people who will like this game, which may not be everybody, right? I mean, I'm making a puzzle game right now, so not everybody likes puzzle games, right? But for the people that I'm making it for, I'm trying to make the absolute best thing for them. And man, I work really hard for that. Now, in return, I am very happy to take their money for that, especially now, because I've spent so much on this project, right? But I want them to be happy about it, right? I want them to feel like the game was worth that much and they're not grudgingly paying it. It's like, I want to give them a good enough experience that they feel like this was really worth it, And there's a different thing going on in AAA, maybe even some indies, right? Because some people are very cynical, but it's just like treating the player as a resource to extract from mainly. And then, yeah, I'm giving you a game, but the game is like just enough of an excuse to try to find the places to pull the money. And I'm going to try to like play on your addictive psychology or whatever to try to help that. And it's a very cynical, mechanistic, exploitative way to design. And I really don't like that. And I've gotten some other game industry people really mad at me in the past when I would just call out their entire shtick as being fundamentally exploitative. I think some of the earliest games that were most blatantly this way were like the Farmville kind of games or whatever, right? Yeah. But really, I don't know. There's been lots of culprits. But to me, that's the dividing line, is like, what is the developer really trying to do? What is their attitude? Do they really want the best for their player, or does it go the other direction? And I think with most games, you can draw a pretty clear dividing line between those two categories. And I'm very happy if people stop buying the exploitative games completely. Yeah. I think that's fine.
Yeah, I wish. No, 100%.
No, they will. I mean,
totally
they have
agree,
big budgets and whatever. So,
no, I totally agree. And consumers too. Like, I mean, again, like I play games. If I play a game, I could tell what the developer thinks just by playing the game. And that's really, really interesting too. And I don't know if they understand that. I don't know if they think everybody's stupid, or I don't know what it is. But do we think that that kind of divide, that PvP that's going on, that we see right now between developers and consumers, do we think that AAA will eventually try to mend that in any way?
Well, I would expect insincere attempts before sincere attempts. Yeah. Right? So, I mean, they have to, right? If they're losing this much money, they have to do something. What are they going to do? Like, I don't know. It's first of all, it's very hard as a company like that to somehow make a blatant statement that you were wrong about the way that you were, right? So I wouldn't expect like a game to start up with an apology screen or anything.
They should.
They should, but I don't expect that, right? But like maybe it starts with, I don't know, like whatever. Okay, you don't like the kind of story and characters that we were doing or whatever. Now we're going to try something different, but their heart wouldn't really be in that either. It's like, the Steve Buscemi shot, like, how do you do, fellow kids?
Yeah,
right? It'll be like that first.
Yeah, I totally think so. I think they're going to try pulling a fast one. And I'm a little bit afraid too, because I don't want to see AAA just completely just die out. I don't want to see that at all, because it's a lot of jobs and a lot of people that still actually do work in AA that care about games. But it's going to take a while, I think, for any kind of course correction, just because of how slow these things are, how long development process is, and a lot of these big budget games. I don't think 2025 is going to be very, very friendly towards AAA either, even if they start course correcting now. And I think it'll be years before we actually see anything come out of it. So I think 2025 is going to be rough.
Even mid-sized games. Like, I think part of it is just, it's become so hard to make games now. Like software, this is something I rant about in other places, but like software is more and more of a mess, and the platforms we're trying to target are more and more of a mess. But like, you look at these let's call them mid-sized games. They still have pretty big budgets, but like, you have a game like Escape from Tarkov, which, you know, people have had some complaints about that game lately, about the developer maybe being exploitative, but certainly for the first very long time, it was clear that this was a game just being made by people because their heart was in it, right? Because it was so different from every other game. And it made so many decisions that like actually made it harder to get into and like more grueling and all that. And it was like, this is for people who, so for people, many people may not know this game. It's like, you know, it's a sort of like a military shooter survival game, multiplayer. And it's just brutally hard. It's brutally hard. And then, you know, some games have come out over the past several years that are similar. Like, they're obviously trying to enter that market because Escape from Tarkov was so successful. Yeah. So, like, there were a couple. I forget what the spaceship one was, and there was the D&D one, and both of those were not. Those games were not very big and complex like Tarkov, so they didn't even manage to really enter the same space. But then you have more recent stuff like Delta Force, which is like more polished, but like the heart is not in Delta Force, I don't feel, right? It's like made with a to-do list. Like, okay, it's like Tarkov, but more like Call of Duty in terms of the shooting, right? And whatever. I actually don't know what the budget of Delta Force is. It's much lower than like a Ubisoft game, a typical Ubisoft game. I don't even, who makes that game?
Oh my gosh. I don't play those games much. I know about it a little bit, but I don't play those games much.
There's an old, I looked it up and it said Nova Logic. If anybody looks that up, that's the very old Delta Force. Timmy Studio Group. I don't know who that is. It might be someone in Asia or something. Anyway, it shows you how much I know. I mean, the industry is really big now, man.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot going on. But the point being, I play that game. I don't feel heart in that game, but I'm sure it's got a much lower budget than like the Star Wars game, for example, right? So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I do think that, I guess you can call that like AA, like the mid-level games, that midsection is going to get caught up in some of this too. I think it's just going to be a difficult year coming up 2025, just in general, with the way 2024 was. Especially for AAA. I still have some friends that do work in AAA that I'm kind of worried about because they're at some studios that are starting to layoffs, and that's not something I'm interested in.
Just for context, for anyone who may not be aware, among other developers who I've talked to, they mostly consider 2024 to have been the worst year for the game industry in the entire history of the game industry, right? And so you would hope that that's like kind of over now, right? But it's January. We've already had probably about as many layoffs as we had in January last year. It's just we're kind of used to it now, so the news is not as loud. But from what I've heard from people, and it sounds like what you're observing as well, you can let me know if this is accurate, is like a lot of teams were just sort of hanging on to see if conditions improve. And these are big teams with a lot of people. But those budgets are very high, and that sort of puts a time limit on how long you can like hang on before you either have to release what you're working on or you got to cancel it, right? So, I mean, I hope as many of these teams, I hope as many of the individual people remain profitably employed as possible. I do believe in the creative destruction of capitalism. If what some of these teams is doing are a big waste of time, I think it's better to dissolve the team and reassign the people to more productive games.
I agree. I don't think anybody. I don't think we should be trying to keep certain studios on life support if they haven't really produced anything that actually hits and that is good, and that would give them another chance to say that these people actually know what they're doing. I don't believe in that. That's what 2010 all over again.
Yeah.
2008, 2010. But which also brings me to the shift gears a little bit, different topic now because we're talking about layoffs and the future of the industry.
Yeah.
AI. How big of a part do you think that will play? Well, first, do you even think AI can handle anything right now, because I've tested it out. I think it's okay at doing some images and stuff, but I know so a lot of the work I did in the past like year or two has been kind of correcting really bad AI code. I'm surprised it's so bad at even like boilerplate still.
Here's what I would say. Well, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, do we think that AI, at least in the future, I don't know, any time frame between now and infinity, if we think that it will essentially take over most of development and be able to automate most processes that we do now to like the same level of skill, and not, I still can't put my finger on the creativity aspect of AI, but at least skill wise, do we think it'll get up there?
I mean, most is a big word, most of development, like you used. So I won't try to predict that far out. I do think at some point it will become a big factor. Let's put it that way, where it'll be helpful enough that if you're not using it, you're at a big disadvantage, right? However, that day is not today, right? And so in the long term, I think AI will become pretty good. I mean, in the long term, we may actually get general intelligence and make it smarter than people. I don't know. But sometime before that, it's like it would become more useful tool-wise. But like, yeah, as you describe, if you don't care what image you get back, it's really astonishingly impressive how good these image generators are, right? But if you're like actually trying to accomplish something specific, it's incredibly frustrating because first of all, you try to generate an image, it's not really what you wanted. And then you try to go into an iterative loop where you try to correct things, and it becomes pretty clear that like the system you're talking to doesn't really understand what's in the image either, right? And I'm sure there are a number of people working on that specific problem, but this is very easy to observe. Like anyone right now can go to Midjourney or Grok or anything like that. You don't have to pay a subscription to use these things, and just like try it out and try to make something try to make like the exact video game character you want that's not a copy of some other character, right?
Yeah.
And you'll find it's very difficult.
Yeah, and the more specific you try to get with AI, the less accurate it is to what you're actually trying to create.
Yeah, for sure.
It starts adding in all sorts of weird stuff.
And a similar thing, it's harder to observe. Bitmaps are very easy to look at and evaluate. Is this what I want? But programming is similar. Like you hear all this hype about how AI is awesome for programming and it makes me so much more efficient, people say on Twitter and whatever. And like anytime someone says that now, I just know they're not very advanced programmers at all and probably spend most of their time doing very boilerplate things that probably shouldn't be programmed in the first place because it's a sign of bad code, right? If you're doing that stuff, then yeah, you tell the AI to like generate the 57,000th version of, reading an event from Windows, and you've got that. But like, that's the sort of thing that's not what somebody really doing interesting work on a game is doing at all, right?
Right.
They're not doing glue code. They're not doing boilerplate code. I mean, there's a little bit of that stuff once in a while, but most of what people making a game are doing is solving very hard problems that have to do with understanding the whole system. Like, so code, another way to describe code is it's a series of very specific decisions that have been made about how things should be done, right? And those decisions all have to work together. And the more lines of code there are, the more decisions there are that all have to be coherent with each other, right? And so to work on the code, you have to understand all the decisions that interact with the code that you're working on. And sometimes those decisions are very invisible, in which case it's helpful if you have a senior programmer on the team who can explain those to you, or if people were very diligent about documenting and commenting, which a lot of programmers are very bad about, right? But those are also the things that AI is horrible at right now with regard to programming. Like, it'll notice patterns, it'll regenerate very specific patterns for small snippets of code, but understanding the nuances of large sets of decisions is just not there. It's not part of what's happening right now. Now, that may improve. And in fact, so part of what's happening right now is that LLMs, large language models, have become so successful that they're sort of getting all the hype right now. And all these companies are like, trying to find the simplest way to make money, like being a wrapper around an LLM
Sorry.
for like a chat agent or whatever, right?
Mm.
I'm a diabetic. That's my alarm going off.
Oh, I didn't hear it at all.
Okay, got it. Sorry, go on.
So that's the main thing, but people have sort of forgot that even before LLMs were this successful, we had good success in other departments. So there was like all the Go playing AI and stuff, right? Like AlphaGo and AlphaZero. Those were not language models, right? They were doing something different. It was still, the term deep learning has been out of vogue for a long time, I think, but it was still that kind of thing. But it wasn't like training on a language corpus and then getting it to play Go, right? It was a different thing. And so at some point, I feel like we're going to top out on language models, and then people will go back and try to integrate them with that kind of thing more. And we'll see. We'll see what that yields. So don't count AI out, right? But like, there's a lot of people overclaiming right now, like tremendously.
You make a great point about not being able to see the entire picture, because you're only looking at something in an incredibly small vacuum when you're trying, hey, give me this function or help me do this. And it's incredibly small in scope. So when I started programming, I taught myself. I just bought books. This is about 11, 12 years ago. I bought books, I think, on like C++. I started doing that, just straight console output, usual garbage. Not really garbage. I shouldn't say garbage, but like compared to what we can do now, it's fine.
Simple things.
Right. And it was fun. It was good. Progressed from there, so on and so kept on going. But I would always try to do things that I didn't understand how to do. So when I never started actually with game development. It was just, I'm just trying to learn C++. I had no idea what it was about back then.
Yeah.
Make a couple programs to set together. Okay, let's draw a window and let's just draw a raster image in a JPEG or something on screen. Let's just do that. Those small little things, you work up from there slowly.
Yep.
More and more. Yep. Draw a triangle. It took forever, by the way. But my first time, I'm not even lying. And then also trying to learn engines at the same time too, because my friends like, oh, learning an engine, it's also a good thing too. So I got into a little bit with Unreal, Unity. After Unity's BS they pulled in September of 23, and then I got out for like a year, just jumping around here and there. Learned a couple other programming languages as well. A little bit of Python, which I thought was fun, but that's mostly for like small home projects and automation. But looking at, and I'm not the best programmer, but I see a lot of code that I've had to correct that my friends are like, hey, this isn't working for whatever reason. I'm like, oh, this looks like it was either got downvoted in Stack Overflow or it's AI. It's one of the two,
Yeah.
And I see a lot of my friends and other people that I know like starting to use AI, and I'm like, well, like you're asking me for help. Like this is stuff that I don't know. I don't think it could do, like right now, like you're saying, it can't see the whole picture. It messes things up. And it barely gets boilerplate correct. I think on a surface level, I think it's impressive to see that it is doing it just in general. Like you're saying with art, it goes to draw a picture and the picture looks good, but the picture's a mile wide and only an inch deep, rather than a nice artist, a good artist will, when they go to paint a picture, it's going to be much more tighter focus. It's going to be very, very deep and detailed and everything else. And that's one thing I don't see AI doing any heavy lifting for quite a long time, like you said, until we can solve the problem of where we could actually like see more and understand more of that kind of like bigger picture, that broader outline of the actual project. But do you even think it's worth? I mean, obviously it's going to be worth it in the long run in the future. But how hard do you think developers should be paying attention to AI right now in terms of just trying to keep their finger on the pulse and see what happens with it, see where it goes, or do a little bit more than that?
I think you keep the finger on the pulse. It's very situational, right? There are several different departments in video games, right? There's programming, which is expensive because programmer salaries are high. You have to write a lot of code. But like really, I think art teams are probably the biggest budget everywhere right now. You need all these people to model in texture and whatever. And so the question is really, the biggest budget impact would be what impact can AI have on that sector of development, right? Because especially if you're going to have these huge open worlds and whatever, people have to make all that stuff. Now, to some extent, that's just an extension of what developers have been doing for a while, though. Like, if you're going to make a giant open world game, you don't place every little weed and rock by hand, because not only is that extremely labor intensive, but then you want to change it. Like, oh, I want a road to go through here, and I want to move all this up by 100 feet and make a cliff, and all the work was wasted, right? And so you tend to want higher level control. So I've got a system that sprinkles rocks around, and I can control some parameters about how the rocks appear, right? And so instead of placing 1,000 individual rocks, I place this one thing, and then I tweak the parameters till I like it, and then I leave it. And then if I have to move it, I just have to move one thing instead of 1,000 rocks, right? And so that's the kind of tool that game content people have been using for a long time. Now, I will say, even at that level of technology that I've described, usually games are made with tools that are worse than what you would have liked to make that game. And so the workflow is never as good as what you would have wanted. But nevertheless, this has been an acknowledged part of game development for a long time. Okay, similarly, for texture maps, which is, if you come up to a surface in a game, you've got geometry of the wall, which is where are the triangles, but then you've got the bitmap that you spread on the wall, right, which is called a texture map for very arcane reasons that probably don't matter. And very often, in fact, probably almost never now are those hand painted in a high budget game. You'd use a synthesis tool, like Substance or something like that, which lets you generate a texture from higher level considerations. And again, you tweak it till you're happy. And then, making a wall is a series of higher level considerations. So maybe I have a brick texture that I'm happy with, and I have a dirt texture that I'm happy with, and I've got an aged brick texture that I'm happy with, and now I'm going to hand paint something, but that thing is now just what is the blend between these different images on the wall. And so I still have a degree of authorship over the wall, but it's not pixel by pixel, right? And so that's what that looks like in that department, right? And so when you start looking at AI, you could start asking this question of how does it fit into this process? Because this is a process that we know is actually helpful, right? You could just imagine, right? Oh, maybe AI just makes the worlds for you or whatever, but are those worlds going to be fun? Probably not, right? Is it, and so you've got to imagine how to insert it into the process such that there's still a degree of authorship. If it's too low in the scale, maybe that doesn't help very much. If you have Substance Designer and you have this rich, I forget, there's Substance whichever one is the texture map authoring one. So if you have this thing and you've got a library of materials that's very fast for you to sift through and search by keyword or whatever and blend, is it really going to help you that much to type into an LLM some English of give me a good brick wall texture? Because you would have just typed brick anyway and just done a regular keyword search and had all these materials, right? And so that's not very helpful. Maybe in the game engine, you could describe something more like, brick wall with dirt along the bottom, and that gives you something that you could tweak. Maybe
I would think in game engines, it's a tool that I would like to see, at least, not so much for generating assets, but using AI if you're making a game that is procedural. I think it could probably be a big help if you already have a template that it could learn from. Well, that's almost like because I'm a self-taught programmer, I don't know most of the terminology. Is it wave function collapse? Where it takes a pattern and it can create permutations of that pattern. Is that? No, I'm thinking of something else.
Wave function collapse is a name for a thing that I don't like because it's, it's playing on the quantum mechanics idea of wave function collapse. But it's one particular method that someone popularized that existed for decades before this, about if you have an open world that's potentially infinite and you're going to move around it and you want to generate new things that are consistent with all the old things, right? That was the wave function collapse algorithm, so-called. But I don't have great respect for wave function collapse algorithm because I don't, whatever. It's a redo of things that had been done many times before under different names.
I'm thinking AI might be useful in that sense, at least as an initial setup, to be able to say, hey, look at our surroundings. This is what you got. This is kind of what you're going for. Here's maybe, instead of here's something brand new that we're trying to build from scratch, here are more stylized permutations that follow the same rule sets that you've given us before. It's almost like writing your own procedural algorithm, but it's just AI that's doing it. I think that could be helpful and useful, especially like you were talking about for, hey, I'm going to place this rock here, 1,000 rocks here. We're not going to place them all by hand, stuff like that.
Well,
I can see AI being go on.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, don't let me interrupt you. I think that's
no,
good.
sorry. I was just going to say that it also, I think it would be a decent help like that too. But we also have a lot of geometry painting tools and stuff like that, that we use now. But I'm more of a programmer. I don't do a lot of the artwork, so I'm not familiar with all the tools that are available. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it can be an iterative process of experimentation and discovery. However, I think what both of us are imagining so far in this discussion is AI that's approximately as intelligent as the systems that we've seen, and then how would you deploy that, right? And so the wild card is always like, what if you actually get AI that's smart and proactively thinking and problem solving the way a person can be, right? Then all of a sudden it's more like an actual member of the team as opposed to a tool slot in a tool thing, right? And that's a little bit more science fiction-y, but I don't think that's off the table. I think that could happen. That could happen, this year for all I know, just because a lot of the previous big advancements were really big surprises. Or it could not happen for 20 years, right?
Right.
Or it could not happen ever because it's impossible. Like we just don't know. So, it's hard to predict these things, right?
Yeah, especially like you're saying with AI, because it's up in the air right now. We could hope that it's going to do good things. We don't know. Maybe this will be it. Like maybe we can't go further for whatever reason. I don't think that's the case, but like you never know. And that's but I'm always interested. Obviously, I love technology. I'm always interested in new technology. But in terms of like the broader AI discussion that we've been having and whether or not it's actually useful to implement now, rather than just it's a fun toy that you look at every once in a while to see how it's doing. And I think it's more, for me, it's more of a, like I said, a fun toy that you just look at, like, oh, look at that flower trying to grow. Like, we'll wait till you get a little bit bigger before that's kind of my thought on it in terms of AI.
Okay, since we've said a lot of counter hype things, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like both of us are not fully convinced by the hype. There are some things that AI is good for, right? So like idea generation. Like if you're just riffing with an LLM, like whatever. I think most of the ideas it would come up with are not that good, but once in a while it's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that myself. Also with image generation, like maybe you're not going to get something you could use, but you could do some style experimentation to just sort of vaguely see what something might kind of look like. And then that's a lot faster than if you did that manually. And then you say, okay, I want something like this, and I'm going to have to paint it myself or something, but at least I have a proof of concept, right?
I can see that.
For programming, I would not at all use one of these systems to actually generate code. If I found out someone on the team was doing this, I would certainly have a stern talk with them to cease and desist immediately. Fortunately, because we use our own programming language, the LLMs are not really trained on it. So results are probably even worse and not usable. So for example, if it's like, hey, so just the other day, I was like, I need to go do Windows raw input stuff. Like, what are the API calls that I need? And you could ask an LLM that, and it'll generally pretty much give you the right answer about what are the relevant functions and stuff. It could mislead you a little bit, but it'll often be better than the available documentation because documentation is notoriously horrible, right? And so that's really helpful. And so those are the ways in which I would use state-of-the-art AI, but this may change by next year, right?
I do think I would like to see, especially like you were saying, especially when documentation, oh my God, just using anything, Unreal, Unity, like, oh my goodness, I could just laugh at it. But it would be interesting to like just to train AI on just that alone, like documentation or stuff that not as a general purpose, but as a highly tuned AI towards a specific set. I think we can get a little bit more leverage out of it that way. I'm not all doom and gloom on AI. I do think that there is a place for it in the future.
I think it makes for a good tool, but not a replacement for people.
Right. The scary part everyone's worried about is if it becomes a replacement, because then where do all the jobs go? That's what I think a lot of people are worried about.
If that happens, though, you have a second order problem, right? Which is, so the first order problem is obviously we don't need to hire as many people to make these games, right? But if it's mostly not people making games, the market is going to be flooded with even more games than we already have. And they're probably going to kind of all be copies of each other. And so there's going to be way more of a trash game problem than we have right now, right? And so then does the industry collapse? Do people just stop looking for? So, for example, on the, when the iPhone came out, I was like, oh, this is such a cool platform for games. It's just touch and it's responsive and all that. And then those games became dominated by, I don't even know what's like. I haven't looked in years at the regular App Store, like top 10 games. Yeah, but it's all been dominated by this style of game that I'm just fully not interested in. So if I look on iOS at all, I would look on Apple Arcade. But even there is like, a lot of these games are just not, I don't think of them as real games, And so what happens if Steam and all game consoles become that way as well due to like AI crappy game flood? What happens? Does the whole industry basically die, right? I don't know.
Anna and I have discussed this before. I think it's going to be like that scene in Secret of Monkey Island where you go in the back alley and the guy with the trench coat, he's the one selling the maps in Monkey Island, but we're going to be selling games made by actual humans to people on the street. Well, I think that's going to eventually happen.
A little bit like dystopian, there's a logo like Energy Star or whatever. There might be a logo like designed and crafted by humans.
Human made, yeah.
There might be. I think I do think that we're going to see. Elon mentioned this. He wants to start an AI game studio. Again, I don't think AI is there yet, but I do think in the future, I think people will be like, there are a lot of consumers that just really don't care. They just want stuff to flash all over the screen and they want the points numbers to constantly come up. It's games made for people with ADD, basically.
Yeah.
But other people I think are going to be yearning for that fingerprint, because you only get that fingerprint from a real human being. AI doesn't have a fingerprint. You look at an artist, even if they're trying to do the same style of line art as like a different artist, there's going to be something that's just a little bit different about it. Maybe it's the palettes that they use. It's their pen strokes, like everything, these tiny little fingerprints that we see. And I don't think AI is going to be able to replicate that at all. And I think that's going to show through with games, like we were talking about earlier with developers and publishers, how you know how they treat what they think of their consumers by how they present the material to them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be the same way with AI. Factually true. However, it may not matter that it's factually true. So if you take just image generation right now, if you take, generate a painting in the style of Matisse, right? Mm-hmm. And then you put a real Matisse next to it to somebody who's never seen that painting before, right? Because obviously super famous paintings you would know. And you just did a quiz where it's like, pick the real one and not the AI generated one. I'm not sure most people would score well on that quiz, even though a very experienced artist might get a perfect score, right? Like someone who's really trained in what does it take to generate images and what would somebody making a very high quality thing care about and all that would be able to spot these signs, but I'm not sure that I would be able to, right? And so maybe it's going to be like that for games. I don't know. Games, if anything. So I'm a designer. design is very subtle and invisible. It's way more invisible than like paint on canvas. And so, if anything, I would expect it to be harder for design than art to notice the difference.
I think that there'll be a niche market for human-made products, just like you see in a lot of other production. You can have the furniture that's made off, the assembly line, and it's going to be the same as everybody else's, or you can get something handcrafted. So
It's
I
like-
Quite
think
possible. Yeah.
Yeah, back in the day, the explosion of homebrew and flash games and whatnot. There's people that just like love that stuff. I think we are going to see that in the future too, for sure. Speaking of development too, switching gears again, straight from AI. What some people have been asking on Discord. I got some questions on development, but right off the bat, what advice would you give someone brand new that wants to get into the industry? Should they? And what advice would you give?
I mean, of course, we've just discussed AI, and I think what that does is it shortens the expiration date of any advice that I would give, right? Because things are changing very quickly, and it's very hard to predict. But I mean, again, I would give the same advice as I normally would have, but just a little bit more 2025 flavored, which is a lot of people just like want to get in the industry and they think that that's success, and or maybe they just haven't visualized more of a plan than that or whatever, right? But when you're in the industry, especially if you're in it for a long time, in every department, let's say every subdiscipline, there are the people who really know what's going on and are respected and are known as competent, right? And there are the people who are just kind of going with the flow. You could probably break it into more like 5 bands or something. There's the people who are like the super competent leaders. That's 5, right? There's like 4 is like above average, right? And then 3 is like there's a lot of average, and 2 is like this person could improve and be good, but and then 1 is like we got to get rid of this guy, right? And you want to be 5 because everything is a lot better. Your life is better. Your relationships with people are better. Your satisfaction with work is probably better, right? I think. And being a 5 doesn't involve necessarily being a jerk or being mean to people or anything like that. It doesn't involve putting other people down. It just involves wanting to be good and taking whatever actions in the moment seem like the best ways to improve. Because if you just do that every day, even for a couple years, you're going to be one of the best people. It's not that hard. But a lot of people land in the industry and they don't have that kind of like, I'm legitimately trying to improve all the time mindset. They would tell you that they do, but then you look at what they do every day and it's just like, well, I'm just cruising, and that's most people. And you will be tremendously successful in the industry if you just don't do that, right? And it doesn't even take more hours to work. Like you could work more hours if you like that, and it probably does improve your rate of increase of abilities. But even if you just work a normal work day like anyone, even if that's like 5 hours a day now or 4 hours or 3 hours, whatever it is, if you honestly tabulate it, you're still going to come out accelerating way ahead of everybody else. If you just observe your own work and judge to yourself how good it is without being negative, not negatively judgmental, but just like, oh, what do I like about how that went? What do I not like? What can I do better next time? And just actively doing that yourself will take you very far. You don't have to wait for other people to criticize your work, right? You can do it yourself.
Flip that the other way now. You don't have to piss people off in the industry that have been around for a while, but what advice would you give to seasoned developers, people who have been in it for a while? Like, I mean, we've talked about a lot of stuff tonight already, but
I don't know. I mean, a lot of people drop out of the games industry, so there's not as many seasoned people as you would expect. And a lot of, I don't know, like, without conspicuously taking a side on this issue on your podcast, there's obviously been a lot of political divisiveness in the industry and upheaval, and I think that has not totally resolved yet. And there are a lot of people who have been in the industry a long time and took very extreme positions on political issues that I think is going to result in them having to leave. Because, again, I mean, ignoring the actual issues, like, look, was your priority trying to make the best game for players, right? Or was it some weird agenda that you had and you think the players are wrong for not agreeing with you, right? And if you have that latter attitude, that's just not going to survive. And so if I think about people my age, you know, I'm a young, sprightly guy still, but there's not that many people my age in the industry, certainly by proportion, because it's been a growing industry, but just a lot of people wash out. Even like, so, you know, the first game that I fully released professionally, that was my design, was Braid way back in 2008. And that sort of was at the leading of this wave of like indie game explosion. And so from, let's say, 2009 to even before Braid in 2008, this started. But up until, let's say, 2013, was like this total gravy train for indie developers. Like if you made a pretty okay game that came out in that window, you were very financially successful and got recognition and all sorts of things, right? A lot of those people who made successful games and made even millions of dollars sometimes, they just kind of wash out and never make another project, right? So success like kills people in indie games a lot of the time, like a tremendously large amount of the time. And so it's weird. But what I would say is, okay, if there's, for the old timers like me, if there's going to be life to games, right? Like there's not that many people in the industry right now who remember what it was like before teams got so big and before budgets got so high and everything got so jaded. There's not a lot of us who remember what it was like before it became incredibly politically divisive, right?
Yeah.
So like
that's the truth.
Gamergate was 10 plus years ago. Like, I'm not sure by numbers how many people have been in the industry more than 10 years, like percentage wise, but it's probably less than half, right? Probably way less than half.
Yeah.
So how many people even remember a time when making games was fun? And you weren't like in fear of, you know, whatever internet crisis or whatever. Not that many of us. And so there's a role for that. There's a role, you know, I'm thinking of this movie again. Hardly anyone's going to know this movie, but it's well worth watching if you hadn't seen it. It's, I think, the 1981 John Borman fantasy movie Excalibur, which is a telling of the King Arthur story. And there's this thing at the end where like Arthur's old and he's like, what? But some, not to spoil the movie, but some things happen to bring him back his inspiration. And he's like, I can ride again and make a difference at the end. And like, maybe that's the role that all the, I mean, almost no boomers are left in the game industry unless they're like VP at EA or something, but we'll say boomer just for the memes. This is the role that the boomers can play, is like they can remember a time when things didn't suck this bad and try to bring it back, you know, because so if you're young and you're new in the industry, you might want things to be fun again and you might have a lot of energy to help make that happen. But I think also examples make it easier. And if you live the examples, then it's maybe not that hard. And so that's like, look, people who are the elder statesmen of an industry have a de facto leadership role and responsibility, right? If you're not going to try to lead the industry in a better place, what are you still doing here, right? Yeah. With your 30 years of experience or whatever, right? And so now would be a really good time in this darkest crisis of the games industry. Now would be a really good time to step up and show some leadership, right? And I'm trying to do that in my own way. It's hard. I know how hard it is. I've been working on a game forever. It's not mass market exactly. Although, it's a puzzle game. My last puzzle game did great though, and so maybe this one will as well. But if you're more on the AAA side, get with it, man. Like bring the good days back. That would be my advice.
I think some that have been around in a little bit are afraid. So I know I've lost. I think it was Rogan who said it best. He goes, "Man, we lost a lot of people during COVID, and most of them are still alive."
Yes,
and that's true. Yes. Like I knew so many more people in the industry before just this past year, and then like I opened my mouth on Twitter, and I'm like, here's just like a room temperature take, and then certainly one side was like, nope, we're not friends with you anymore. And these are some people that I was actually kind of sad to lose because they were. I've known them, for a long time. Like one of my friends, I met at Guerrilla Games in 2007, and we've been friends like ever since.
Yeah.
And then just like one day, he's like, "You're not the person I thought you were." I'm like, "I'm the exact person I've been this whole time." And it's, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. The games industry was pretty crazy. It still is pretty crazy in this way, and I hope some healing can happen. That healing hasn't happened yet. A lot of these people who would just dump their friends on a dime like that are still doing that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, look, hey, have ideological disagreements, right? I think that's America, right? If we're talking about the game industry in America, I don't know about Europe and whatever, but America used to be you can have disagreements and work together and get along, and that stopped around 2014. And I think if we get that back, that'll go a long way. But I mean, man, it's been a long time since that was the environment. I don't know if the culture of a larger company can be salvaged in that way. I think if a company has let its culture become this kind of constant espionage, someone's gonna snitch on me for the slightest thing and my reputation's gonna get ruined, because the exact nature of the infraction doesn't really matter. Like once that's established, then once you chase out all the blatant violators of your ideology, now there's a next ring of people closer in, and then you attack all those people, and there's a next ring of people closer in, right?
You're always
or everybody else is just silent and whatever. And I think that's become the culture at a lot of these places, especially because since there's a lot more remote work, it's like all this communication via Slack and whatever, which is poison for this stuff. And so I don't know that that's fixable. Like, I think if there's a company like that, you have to dismiss the vast majority of the staff and then rehire, because you can't just declare this is the company culture now and then have people do it. People are going to do what they want, what they think is right or whatever, right? And so maybe the next EA or the next Ubisoft is, a 10-person company right now, or a 2-person company. And, isn't it interesting, actually, in the earlier days of games, these companies grew up and became big, but like, dude, I don't know if people know this who are younger, Electronic Arts and Activision, for example, to name two, I mean, Activision Blizzard now, right? They made home computer games in the 80s. Like, that's how long these incumbents have been around. Like Pitfall on the Atari 2600 game console from the early 80s, which is so primitive, nobody would game on it now unless they're a masochist. Like, it had a little Activision logo in the corner that displayed the whole time that you played the game.
They were actually
that's
part
how long
of the
Activision's been around.
Yeah, they've been around forever. Yeah. They were actually part of the first real crash happened in like the early 80s, when around right 83.
Yep.
I think they played a part in that because they were releasing a whole lot of shovelware games for the 2600. Yeah. They were just pumping out games like crazy. I remember I have a collection that's boxed up right now, but I have every Atari cart. They're from my childhood, and then obviously subsequently,
I wish I kept
growing
mine,
older.
dude. I was so foolish.
I only kept a few things. and I'm kind of mad about it. I have an NES over here. My Atari 2600 is boxed up. It's actually kind of Frankenstein because I fixed it over the years. And some of the switches broke. Well, I'm just going to use this other switch I got and we'll solder it to the back and do everything else. But a lot of the games that I have are Activision. A lot of them are garbage. So they did definitely contribute early on. But later, as I got to be, get a little bit older, become a teenager and whatnot, Activision was still a big game. Then you do that produce quality products, just like EA, especially Blizzard. Yeah. Jesus, their early days, holy cow. And now they're just like this shell of their former selves. I think to change anything, two things have to happen to some of these larger companies. They might be too big to move, but they either have to just completely that's it, implode, go under, they're just done forever, or someone in Elon has to come in and literally do what he did with X. Just buy the company, be like, nope, this is all going to change. We need to do it. I'm just going to waste a whole bunch of money doing it, but I don't think anybody will.
I mean, even though that was a very successful example, I think that looks so risky to investors that you really won't see much of that unless a company is really, really, really dire, right? Like, so I could see, there's a certain kind of a liquidation event that happens when it's like, look, the company has all these people, they're losing so much money. We feel like if we were to lay people off, you wouldn't be able to make games anymore anyway. So what you have that's valuable is the IP, that we're going to sell the IP to other parties, right? That's happened before a number of times in the industry. Happened to Atari, for example, speaking of Atari. You might see this now that this playbook has been run. You might see this as something that people try before doing that. They might be like, okay, we would liquidate the whole company traditionally, but Elon tried this thing, so let's try to bring a young buck in to Elon style run it. But the problem is, it's not just laying off 80% of the people. Like, you also have to be incredibly effective in managing that remaining 20% of the people to do all the right stuff. And you have to make the right decision about who are the 80% that you're laying off, right? Which even Elon made some mistakes there, but you don't have to be perfect. But it's hard. It's really hard to make that happen. And so I don't expect most people really to try it. But you might see some.
Yeah, you would need to know that you have consumers on your side before you did that. And I think Elon knew that he had a lot of people on his side when he went to go to Twitter. I think that's why it was kind of an easy pull for him. To do it and to pull it off is because there's so much sentiment and a lot of people like Elon, a lot of people hate him. I'm just indifferent. He's just Elon.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people in the games industry, especially the American. Like, if you think of like who's a studio head or designer that has overwhelmingly positive reception, right? Do you think like Miyamoto, right? Like, or somebody like that, right? I don't know. There's some number of names that you could name
that I would get behind for sure.
But there's not that many, right? So I don't know, man. Like, how do you like getting that inspirational leader figure in seems very difficult.
I think so. All right, switch gears again. You still got time? You got a couple more minutes?
Yeah, I could go a bit.
Okay, we got some questions here from members of our Discord, if that's okay. Some of the other devs.
Yeah.
All right. Jarnod, I don't want to say his real name on stream, but Jarnod asks, do you start your game making process with the whole idea in your head or with a seed that blossoms into the final project? If you did it differently for different projects, which one did you enjoy more and which one yielded better results?
Okay, this is a very hard thing to answer. What I would say is, I never know the whole idea because games are just really complicated and they have a lot of ideas in them, right? But I usually know enough of the idea to know it's a good game, right? I usually know enough of the idea to be like really excited about it. And if I don't even know that, there's one game that I still need to go back and do after this one's done, where like it was more like, oh, what if I did this? Would that be cool? And then I just spent a week, no pressure. It's just a week on vacation that I'm going to make this thing, and I made it, and it was really good. And then I knew the idea this is an interesting one because the reason I didn't go finish it up is there's one sector of the game that's really fun, but to build it out into a full thing, I wanted one or two other like segments of the game, and I didn't manage to land those, right? And so that sort of went back in the closet for me to think about for a while. But games that the sort of the three games, only three, man. Braid, The Witness, and the game that I'm working on now, which is close to done. We're about a year out from finishing, hopefully. Which sounds like a long time. We've been working on it 9 years. It's not that long, right? So, in fact, it's a crash course to get it done in a year. So all of those games, I knew enough of the idea to get confidently started and know that it would be a good game. But the bigger the game is, the harder it is to know everything to like land the plane when you take off, right?
Yeah.
So you have to learn how to land the plane in the middle and make it everything that it should be. So with Braid, I didn't know the ending of the game, which is now one of the more remarkable things that people know about. And in fact, even the fact that you collect puzzle pieces in the game was not in the original prototype. It was just about getting through the levels, right? So all that came later. But the basic idea of the game about the time and the worlds was all there from day one. And even the way the story worked, I knew all that. In The Witness, I knew a little bit less. I don't want to spoiler things for people who haven't exactly played the game, but there's like a secret, highly enjoyable thing about the game that you don't want to be spoiled on. And that was the point of the game, and I knew that before I sat down for minute one, right? And then there was like, how do we get you to that moment, and what are the game mechanics and all that? And I kind of knew some ideas to try, and it turned out that they worked, although it was an iterative process to get there. And then, the endings of the game I didn't know, and I had to figure those out during development. The new game is so big. There's so many. I've basically got them all figured out. But like, I knew the basic idea. I knew that was going to be enjoyable. But like, I didn't realize how big of a game it was going to be. I realized at some point, we need a much bigger. So both Braid and The Witness don't really have traditional stories. This game was going to be like, I need a more traditional story, but it needs to be good and it needs to be appropriate to the game and on theme and all that. I have very high requirements for this kind of things. And I just didn't know the right answer to that for a long time. And I didn't really have time to think about it because I was working on all these other things because the game's so big. In the past month, I've got enough story bits that I'm mostly happy with it, although it still needs to like come together. But that I felt really, it was like emotionally negative for years whenever I came to story, because I was like, oh man, I don't know what to do and I'm going to have to figure it out. Endings, I also didn't really know for a long time. And then I had an idea for an ending and that sort of got elaborated, and then we built it out to two, and then there was an idea that there would be two endings, but I didn't know why they were good and different from each other. And then started figuring that out, and then we expanded it to three endings because that made more sense. And it was only like 2 months ago that I figured out why the endings were good. And only like 3 weeks ago that I actually implemented an example of like, okay, this is enough of the final ending that it's going to be satisfying for people and rewarding to get there. And so, I mean, it depends. It depends on the game. The bigger the game is, the harder a time you're going to have seeing enough of the thing in advance to really be super confident. But it helps if you have more experience and you can just say like, look, I know when I'm going to get there. I'll do at least a pretty good job solving this problem, No,
it's good. Yeah, it's always one of those things. The iterative process is always one of those things. Since a lot of the stuff that I did was, just jumping from helping friends, jumping from project to project, just as, just doing additional stuff, this, that, and the other. Most of the time, the stuff most of the stuff I did in between those times was like really small, like little arcade projects. So I could never really iterate on anything big. But I do like that though. Like small projects, tightly focused projects that you could play for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and an hour. Those are also incredibly fun to have. I think those are worthwhile experiences and really fun and rewarding to make, because you're putting yourself in this tiny little box where I've got to get everything done and trying to put it all in a 20-minute window that makes sense.
Yes.
But that's a challenge in and of itself, almost just like it is trying to make a gigantic game. So
well, and if you're getting started, do that. Do what you said. Don't do what I do. Don't spend 9 years on a game if you're getting started, because it's not going to come out that well. You don't have that much practice yet. Do something like, and if you think it's going to take 2 months to make, it'll probably take a year. Again, because that's just how it goes, especially when you're new. So try to make it interesting, but don't try to make it ambitious in terms of scope yet. You could do that later, right?
Yeah, for sure. The other question for one of our members of the Discord, Griswold, asks, it says you invested over 6 figures into Braid out of your own pocket. How did you decide where to invest, and when should an indie developer decide to invest in their project? Is there anything that you feel is most or least important to invest in?
Well, it's I don't remember the specific numbers, but a significant fraction of that was just my living expenses. I mean, I was living in San Francisco, which was not a cheap city even at that time, although it was probably cheaper relatively than it is today even. And so 3.5 years of my expenses, if you imagine that was $50,000 a year or something, right? Maybe it was less. I don't know. I'm trying to, but whatever, right? That's 160, 170,000 all of a sudden. That sounds like a lot of money, but like, that's what it costs to live in that place. If I'd been living somewhere tremendously cheaper, that budget could have been substantially lower, right? And so that is a viable tactic, right? If you don't have a ton of money saved up, you can always just like live somewhere cheap, right? But so there was that. There was, I paid a contract artist for 1.5 years, and that cost, I don't remember, it was probably like $35 an hour to start. Again, it's San Francisco, right? So it was $35 an hour to start, and then maybe a little higher toward the end. That adds up really fast when you're paying someone like that. And then there's some sound contractors and a little bit of programming help at the very end, but I don't usually include that in the main budget because my friend did it for free at the time, and he was like, pay me back after the game makes some money, right? And so I probably should include that in the budget, but it was like the game was made and launched with less money than that, right? And it was, I don't know, it was probably an extra $25,000 or whatever that he pitched in terms of his own, like at his market rate, which is like for a very high-end programmer is like a lot, right? A lot of money. That was the majority of it. There was probably lots of other, so the main artist that I paid on contract to help with the game in terms of number of hours worked was David Hellman, who is sort of responsible for the final look of the game. But before he came on, I actually worked with Ed McMillan of like Team Meat and Binding of Isaac, so people may know him. He did a lot of the initial work around helping design the characters and just getting it looking a little more like a game. Because when you just have really crappy programmer art, if you're really confident, you could have some esteem about your game. But like, you look at it and you see that it's super crappy. But like, even if you just have some actual characters drawn by somebody who draws, it's like it's a lot better, right? And so getting the game into that initial phase, he really did a lot, and that was helpful. Got
one more here for you. Speaking of, no, that's interesting. I don't know. Back to that, but the thought that was going through my head is, I don't think I would ever put that much money towards anything I'm making.
But it's just like, again, the majority of it was just me living, right? So imagine you were taking like a 3.5 year break from jobs. and you were just doing whatever you wanted, but instead of what you want to do is hang out on an island sipping coconuts, it's like, I just want to make a game. So it's kind of like that. Except it's a lot higher pressure than that, actually. But
thinking of it that way is like, I probably would do it if I didn't spend money on fun toys, right? Like if I got arcade machines, I've got cars in the garage, ammo's not cheap, so you got to buy that constantly. So it's like if I had, if I cut back on some of that stuff, I could probably shift more towards projects and stuff. But still, though, not having the time to sit down or the experience with working on something for that length of time.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that I'm a program, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be good at designing a huge game, right?
Yeah.
People who can play the piano, that doesn't mean you're a musician. But that's not. It is really. It's enjoyable to see people when they jump in like that and see them succeed. And believe in themselves when they have good ideas. It's success stories like that are always good because it's a chance no matter what, no matter what you're doing. Yeah. Even if you're seasoned, it's a chance. That's just how it goes. But one more question here from one of our Discord members. Sorios asks, what is your process when it comes to designing puzzles?
Okay, well, here's the thing. It hasn't changed that much from a speech that I gave with my friend Mark Tenbosch, who was working on. So this speech was in 2011 at a conference called Indiecade, and we sort of outlined how we do things, and we have a very similar thought process. His game still isn't out, but I gave this sort of during the first half of designing The Witness, so it'll also tell you what I was thinking about, and I have examples from the game in that speech. Mm-hmm. The basic ideas of how I design a puzzle haven't really changed since then. It's just I've gotten better at it and more refined. Just like if you're a tennis player, hopefully you keep getting better and whatnot, or any activity that you do. So it's like that. That's the best reference that I can give people. What I will say is I can, just to make this not a total divert non-answer, I can outline it a little bit. And it's that I don't think of a puzzle just as a thing that you have to get right or else you're dumb, right? Or whatever, right? Like, you can't get the answer to the puzzle. That's actually not that fun, even for people who are good at puzzles, right? I mean, maybe for a small percentage of people who are good at puzzles. But the problem is that's what a lot of designers think a puzzle game is, right? But I think a good puzzle game has a point to the puzzle. It has something that you can observe and take in as part of your understanding about the world. And this is actually not that different. So like if you play, Elden Ring, like a game like that, right? Part of what you're doing, both in the game generally, but also if you go fight a specific boss or something, is you're learning about the behavior of this boss and how things work and how your attacks work and what's effective here and what's not. And you're observing things about this system and you're using that to create a good result, right? So Elden Ring is like one action version of that. There's another one is like a bullet hell shooter or something, right? And there's a puzzle game version of that where you observe the concepts in the world and you develop a more sophisticated and deeper understanding of what these concepts are. And it's satisfying to understand this big picture of what is this universe in this game. And so when I design puzzles, I'm trying to figure out how to make those things that go into your head the most interesting and the most enjoyable, which is very different from making a puzzle hard or making it like anyone can make a puzzle that's like obfuscated and hard to see what the point is and difficult to solve for that reason, right? Or anybody can make a puzzle that's just like a lot of steps. Oh, this puzzle's too easy. Let's have 15 more steps that you have to do before the objects get in the place where you can solve it from, right? And it's just a very low level of design craft, and a lot of games do it. But what we talk about in that speech is some set of principles that you can use to guide you in terms of having these better ideas.
That's good. I'm a huge fan of puzzle games, although I'm not good at designing any of them. But a lot of that makes sense, especially when you're talking about like the failure states and the failure conditions for the player. Like how hard do you want to go on the player? When they do, do you start deleting achievements? You know, like no, we're gonna remove this one that you got earlier. That's an interesting way to think about it too. Is that it doesn't always have to be. You're trying to teach a broader lesson than just make sure things go in the correct places so you can unlock the thing and move on.
Yeah, and there's some weird stuff about this. So like if a puzzle's way too easy, like it's letting you win or whatever, then that's not good because you sort of don't have respect for the game and you're not really engaged. But then also because you're not thinking about things very well, because you didn't have to solve it, like you're not actually getting this clear picture in your head of what the ideas are because you just don't have to care, right? And then there's some sweet spot where you have to observe and think enough about it that you care. And then if it's way harder than that, it's actually bad because if the value that I'm trying to give you as a designer is like frames in this beautiful movie of what are the ideas of this game, right? If those frames come too slow, if it's like 1 frame per 20 minutes or 1 frame per 2 hours, the idea flow is going to be so slow that it's maybe unenjoyable or may even be much harder to perceive, right? So if you take a song that's really nice, that you enjoy, if you slow down the speed to like half, it'll be like, it's not that fun to listen to anymore, right? If you slow down the speed by a factor of 10, you may not even realize it's a song anymore. It may just sound like weird, mild ambient background. Like the music property of it is completely gone. And there's something about that with puzzle communication as well.
I've never thought about it like that before.
Yeah, me neither.
No, that's another interesting way to put it too, with that comparison. Yeah, no.
Someday I'm gonna do a speech about this where I start by actually playing a song at different speeds.
That's a good way to get attention.
I'm going to do that.
What is this guy doing?
Yeah.
John, I really appreciate you coming out. We're going out like 2 hours right now. I think we're going to cut you loose before I keep you any longer.
That's been great. Thanks.
Ton of more questions. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us. I'm incredibly delighted that you did. Still nervous. Just like I was at the start talking to you. It's been a blast. So we covered a lot of topics. We'd love to have you back on again sometime in the future.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe when this game comes out or slightly before or something would be a good time.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Because then people can see what I'm talking about in the most modern instance, right?
Yeah. Anything you want to shout out? Like your socials or anything? Let everyone know where you find you.
Dragonsweeper was really good, like we mentioned. That's itch.io / I don't know, something Daniel Ben maybe, but search for Dragonsweeper, it'll probably come up.
I'll post up a link.
Yeah, aside from that, I don't know, you could search for me on Twitter or something and sign up.
That works.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. All right, everybody. We'll catch you guys later. Everyone have a good one. Peace.